Hello, this is Caleb Keith, director of the 1517 Podcast Network, with a message of thanks to you, our podcast listeners. During the month of June, we hosted a fundraiser with a goal of $150,000. Not only did we hit that goal, we exceeded it by $14,000, raising $164,000 this June. We couldn't have done it without your help. And it is extremely encouraging to see and to hear that our podcasts are having the impact that we intend, delivering the comfort of the gospel of Christ for the forgiveness of sins to listeners every single day of the week. And we appreciate your support because that tells us that we are on mission, that we are doing what we have set out to do, and that listeners are looking to support that and to help the podcast network keep those shows in development and actually keep expanding those shows onto new platforms. And so we greatly appreciate your support. Thank you for helping us out this June.
Welcome to another episode of 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. 40 Minutes in the Old Testament is a 1517 Podcast Network podcast. You can go to 1517.org/podcast and check out all the podcasts that are living over there. And while you're over there, make sure you go over and check out the events page because there's an event coming your way. It's over in Flower Mound, Texas. It's September 6th and 7th. And Chad's going to be there, and I'm going to be there, and Eric Sorensen's going to be there, and Kelsey Klabara is going to be there, and there's going to be some other people as well. You can check out the roster. It's a day-and-a-half event. We're going to be talking about encounters with Jesus. We're going to look at the stories about what happens to different kinds of people when they meet up with Jesus. Sometimes those encounters go awesome. Sometimes those encounters don't go awesome. We're going to look at all of it. It's going to be a good time. Come hang out with us. You can get all the information over at the site. Get registered. We'd love to see you there. Chad, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. And we are there's no header on this, there's nothing like that. It's just a continuation, just straight up continuation. And what it's continuing, we got like a little bit of a positive end to chapter 5, but he's sort of going to go right back into like, hey, I have witnessed other evils, and I would like to tell you what some of those are.
Yeah, that's the way the chapter begins. There is an evil. He might have said there is another evil. Yeah, I've got a lot of evils, a lot of vanities, a lot of striving after the wind that I want to talk about, and this is next on the list. Here's the evil that he has seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. Okay, what is this? A man to whom God gives wealth and possessions and honor so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Sounds very Solomonic, by the way. So this guy has everything, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It's a grievous evil. I think it's pretty beyond dispute, right? That everyone would agree to that. You get a guy who has, you name it, possessions. Yep, it's got them. Honor. Yep, has that. Wealth. Yep, lacks nothing, and yet is unable to enjoy them. And we're not told why, whether that is an early death or whatever it might be. He can't enjoy them. But instead, a stranger comes along and enjoys them. Well, this too is hevel. That Hebrew word often translated as vanity. And as if that's not clear enough, he goes on to specify that it's also a grievous evil. That is to say, when things like this happen under the sun, then what's the point of it all? It's meaningless. It's vanity. When it doesn't matter what you have, what you can boast of, even if it's something good like honor, but you can't enjoy it. Well, then what's the purpose of it? Especially when instead of you enjoying it, it's passed on to a stranger, and he is able to take everything that was yours and to enjoy it himself. That is a grievous evil. And then he continues, verse 3. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial. We might even say something like, and on top of this, he has no burial. I say that and he sounds very Job-like, and what he's about to say here. I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes, that is the stillborn child he's talking about, it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it, again, the child, it has not seen the sun or known anything. And yet it finds rest rather than he, that is this guy who lost everything. Even though he, the rich man who lost everything, shall live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoys no good, do not all go to the one place. This is you can't get much more Ecclesiastes than this. I mean, there are some parts of Ecclesiastes that you might see, fitting into some other wisdom literature, but when you get something like this, it definitely carries the whole tone of Ecclesiastes that we've seen. But it's not entirely unique, because we had seen statements like this, like at the beginning of Job, when he curses the day of his birth and wishes that it had never taken place. And other places in the scriptures also we use the image of a stillborn child, although not quite as blatant as it is here, where it's saying, yeah, this guy who lived all these years and had all these kids, and yet he's not able to be satisfied with the good things in life, and has no burial. When it says has no burial, that evidently means that he doesn't receive a proper burial, which not only just in our culture, but certainly in the ancient cultures would have been considered one of the worst things that could happen to a person, where your body is just kind of left exposed to decay out in the open. Not to receive a proper burial was just unthinkable in the ancient world.
Yeah, isn't the idea there that if you're a guy and you have 100 children, so there's a lot of kids, but you have no burial, is that obviously your children all despise you. So you have 100 kids, and not one of them is going to show up to give you a proper burial. So nobody, and not only them, but like nobody else. So it's sort of double. It'd be one thing if you were like born, had no children, you died, and no one cared. You're like, well, that would be a big tragedy. That's not a good. That's not a good life. What if you had 100 children and none of them cared about you either? Like no one cared enough to show up and make sure that you were put to rest properly. You say, yeah, that a stillborn child is better off than that, because probably that stillborn child's being buried properly, and so even a stillborn child could have people that cared about it. Whereas opposed to the illustration here is this guy has 100 children, and so it's not only that he has no one that cares about him, he has people that should care about him that don't.
Yeah, this is a perfect case of hyperbole to prove a point. Surely there's gonna be one of those 100 children, but no, there's not. He's unable to be satisfied with the good things he has in life, and even when he leaves this life, no one around him, none of his children, none of his friends, nobody else cares to give him a proper burial. So outwardly, it might have seemed as if, God, this guy had it made. He didn't. In fact, if we're just making comparisons, that stillborn child is much better off than he, because at least he finds rest. So anyway, that's the first 6 verses. Starting out, some optimistic, positive material here in Ecclesiastes. He's got more to come. Verse 7. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have, who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. So this section, these verses 7 through 9, are like a lot of Ecclesiastes. Sometimes it seems a bit disjointed. It's hard to kind of trace the thematic chain of reasoning that you have from one to the other. But this seemed to be a case where, and we'll see more of this in the next chapter too, where you have a contrast set up where one thing is better than the other. But in the end, even if you have something that's better than something else, in the end, you always come to the same conclusion in Ecclesiastes. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. So you have a guy who's toiling, he's working for basics, at least for food, and yet his appetite is never satisfied. And what advantage has the wise man over the fool? what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? So yeah, maybe there's a, maybe there are some things that are better about being wise or better about being a poor man who knows how to conduct himself. But in the end, even though these things are better on the scale, in the end, it's all still vanity and striving after the wind, if this life is all there is.
Yeah, I mean, this reads to me like if you're just gonna have the most pessimistic outlook ever, you're gonna say like, well, I mean, especially at the time this was written, obviously things are a little different now as far as most people don't work hand to mouth anymore. But
Right.
of course, back then a lot of people did. Like you're sort of a big part of your life, a huge portion of your life is trying to make sure that you have food, whether it's growing food or hunting food or whatever it is, right? And so like there's a lot of toil involved, and especially if you have a family, of being like, can I keep these mouths fed? And the bummer about that is that you might be like, oh, good, I got food. But the truth is that you're going to be hungry again. Like, so this is like a never ending cycle, right? Where so you're like,
Yeah.
my toil is for my mouth. And unfortunately, it's not like this happens once. This happens continually until the day I die.
Yeah. And that the repetitive nature of it and the fact that you never get enough, right? That again kind of is a parabolic, we might say, of the entirety of Ecclesiastes. I mean, we saw that in the opening chapter, right? These things come and these things go, and yet there's never an end to it. There's never any fulfillment, there's never any satisfaction. So, you might have enough today, but guess what? Tomorrow you're going to want more. And you might have enough tomorrow, but the next day you're going to want more as well. And in the end, you're unsatisfied because none of these things are going to be able to satisfy you completely. And the same thing could be said really for wisdom or for even a poor man who, has some knowledge in his head. Well, that's fine, but in the end, none of that is going to be what truly brings a person to fulfillment and satisfaction and being in a place in life where they actually understand who God has made them to be and what this life is all about.
Yeah, it's funny that this is a pretty simple analogy, but have you ever eaten, like maybe you go somewhere to eat and like you eat like a massive meal and like you're super full and you think to yourself like, I might never eat again. I'm so full right now, like I can't even imagine being hungry again. But then like 12 hours later, you're like, where are we gonna go eat?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've had that happen many times. Very recently, in fact, a huge dinner and stuffed. And I can almost always eat dessert, but so full I don't even want ice cream or whatever. And then I get up the next morning and it's 8 or 9 o'clock and my stomach is growling. I'm like, what is wrong with me? You know, you think I could fast the whole next day and never be hungry. Yeah, and not even 12 hours has passed, and all of a sudden,
Yep.
yep, appetite's not satisfied. Always wanting more. Well, such is human life. And you could expand that, of course, to any number of things. There's something you really wanted, something pleasurable that you really wanted to experience. And maybe not even an illicit pleasure, but whatever it is. And you get that thing and it's great. But then afterward, it's like there's still an emptiness there.
Yeah.
There's still that hole within us that never is going to be filled up even halfway because we're created for greater things.
Yeah, and even if it is, if you have the illusion of satisfaction, it's or fulfillment, it's extremely fleeting, right? Like it's all temporary, like food.
Yeah.
Like it's like, yeah, you might be like, oh, I'm full now, good. Like now I can live the rest of my life with this food that I've eaten, and no, it all goes away.
Yeah. I mean, you see this all the time, especially with people striving for certain, maybe it's a degree, maybe it's a job, maybe it's you know, a gold medal, whatever it is, they're really pushing themselves toward, and they finally get there. They finally attain what they had dreamed of having. And you hear them talk afterward, and it's like it didn't really give them what they thought that it would. Because I mean, we easily delude ourselves into imagining that once I reach this particular goal that I've really been striving for, then I'll be happy the rest of my life. I will find contentment in that thing which I wanted above all else. And that thing you wanted above all else turns out to be fine for the moment. But the next day or the next month or the next year, all of a sudden you realize that, it really could not give me what I truly wanted. And so people either learn their lesson and start looking above the sun, or as happens sometimes too, they look for the next thing that they're going to really work hard to attain and think that's going to be what it is. And it never is. Appetite is never satisfied. Okay, so just have, it looks like a couple of verses, 3 verses to go in this chapter. Pretty short chapter. It's only 12 verses. So he goes on to verse 10. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. I assume that is referring to God there, one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity. And what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? This is, again, very consistent with what we saw in chapter 1 with regard to things coming and then things passing away, or to the lack of knowledge a man has of what is going to be coming down the road. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and he's not able to dispute with one stronger than he, which, like I said, I believe that's referring to God. That sound right to you, Dan?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know who else this would be referring to. Now, when he says in verse 12, who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? I think this is setting us up for what we're going to see in chapter 7. He says, who knows what is good for man? And the typical Hebrew word for good is used there, tov. And tov is going to be used repeatedly in chapter 7. And most of your verses will have better. It's used as a comparison, but it's the same word, tov. So he sets up the question here. Who knows what is tov, what is good for man while he's here in this vain life, which he passes like a shadow? So he kind of sets up the question and makes it seem as if, well, nobody knows, but he's going to give us in the next chapter at least a few ideas of, at least comparatively speaking, what is good in the sense of what is better than something else. But he kind of just leaves us hanging here in this verse. Who knows when this vain life what is going to be good for us?
I think
So
this whole section leading into chapter 7 is kind of humorous, because on one hand, in verse 11, he says, "The more words, the more vanity." Right. So like the more words you got, the more vanity you're speaking. And who can really know what's good for man? And you could just end it there, where it's like, no, like don't try to figure it out. But instead, he's going to say, a lot with more words comes more vanity. No one can really know what's good. But let me tell you. And then he speaks a bunch of words in a very a very poetic way. and like, I don't think it's like this sort of like hypocrisy thing. I think it's more like with many words being spoken comes much vanity. But on the other hand, it's all we've got. So like, get ready. I'm about, like, take it or leave it. But I'm about to try to break this down for you. Just know, though, I understand that a lot of words include a lot of vanity.
I'm about to sin boldly. Yeah. I'm about to take my advice and break it.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost kind of self-deprecating humor is probably not the accurate description, but it's kind of like that, It's like, yeah, I know that it's not right to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Or I know that it's vain to do what I'm about to do, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's all I got, like you say. If we're living life under the sun and we've cut ourselves off from divine wisdom, then let's make the best of it, and let's see what at least is better if A is better than B or if B is better than C. So that's where it's where he's gonna start out here in chapter 7. And these first few verses are mainly about death and life, kind of mortality themes that are coming up here. Day of birth and day of death, and house of mourning and house of feasting, and sadness and laughter. He's going to make a lot of contrast here. And I mean, it's on the one hand, he's giving the best shot that he has, uh, given his chosen perspective under the sun, and yet at the same time, there's some truths that are certainly embedded within these verses as well. So I'll start out reading. Oh, I don't know, maybe the first 4 or 5 verses. Chapter 7. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning, that's MOU, mourning, than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Let me take in 2 more verses. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For this is one of my favorite verses in Ecclesiastes. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. I've always thought that's just like a perfect description. Just you hear the crackling of I grew up out in the country where we had a lot of tumbleweeds, and they'd get piled up against a fence, and my dad would I would get out there and we'd pile them up and we'd burn them just to get rid of them. And the the crackling perfectly described what would take place when you burn these tumbleweeds. And so when I hear about the crackling of thorns under a pot, I hear that the crackling of these tumbleweeds burning and the cackling laughter of fools. So it's great image for capturing that. So he starts out here with this first contrast about life and death, that the day of death is better than the day of birth, and it's better to go to a place where people are grieving and mourning than to a place where people are having a good time and feasting. And I think the end of verse 2 kind of sums up his main point in these opening verses, that that is to say, death itself and everything accompanying that is the end of all mankind. That's, of course, where we're all heading. And by devoting yourself to thinking about the day of your death and to being with those who grieve and those who mourn, he says the living will lay it to heart. This is this idea, of course, of remembering death and keeping in mind our mortality, which we see, of course, taught in various ways throughout the scriptures. So I think this is him using the wisdom that he has. Who knows what is good for man, he said at the end of chapter 6. Who knows what is good for man while he lives a few days of his vain life? And this is the beginning of his answer. Well, this might be good, that you do this instead of that, because we all know that we're heading for the grave. So let's stand around the grave and ponder the fact that we will be there and what we can learn about life from remembering the end of our life.
Yeah, I mean, it's on one hand, you're like, this is not true. Like, it's like, hey, what's better, to go to a funeral or a feast? And you're like, I'll go to the feast. Thank you very much. But I think what Solomon's saying here is that if you spend your life always choosing the feast over the funeral, you learn more about yourself at the funeral than you do at the feast. And so you could try to avoid this all you want, but that would be what a fool would do.
Yeah. I mean, there's anyone who has experienced that closeness to death, whether someone, family member or close friend or whoever it might be, and you've been to the graveside, you've been to the house of mourning, you've you ponder the death of your loved one. Man, that I don't think there's anything better for coming to grips with the brevity of life and focusing and upon what's, really essential than that. I mean, there's you can read all the books you want about death and the brevity of life and all of that, but until you've experienced that, there's very few things that really work on you the way that that does.
Yeah, and then when he says it's like sorrow is better than laughter, again, you're like, is that true? I mean, I don't. That's not how I want it at all. But then he says, "For by sadness, the face of the heart is made glad, and the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning." Like, I think you can sort of read that as, well, it depends on what you think is important, and not that laughter, of course, is bad, but if you think wisdom is worth having, so the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. Is I think you could read that as the heart is made wise in the house of mourning,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
so, like a wise person would not avoid the house of mourning because this is where you would gain some of that wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, laughter is good. I mean, it's great to laugh even in the midst of grieving. It's at least it's a temporary relief. But I think maybe what he's getting at here too is that laughter can be almost a narcotic at times. For people, it's a way you laugh your life away.
Yeah,
Especially if you view it in kind of this broad sense of I just want to be entertained. That's the way that I get through life. I just want to be entertained. I just want to laugh my way along. Well, I mean that laughter and entertainment is fine to go, of course, in moderation. But it's pretty hard to kind of, you know, focus upon the true essentials of life if that's your go-to to get you through life. Because there's great wisdom to be found in sorrow. I mean, Jesus himself in the Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn,
yeah.
for they should be comforted. So there's some beatitude like truth that's embedded in these verses.
Even in those verses, blessed are those who mourn. It would be like better translated, oh, the blessedness of those who mourn,
Mhm.
which is better translated like, oh, the happiness or the joy of those who mourn. And so like these things aren't disconnected. That joy is more pure for the person who is familiar with mourning. And Solomon says this when he says, "For by sadness of face the heart is made glad." In other words, if you've never mourned, sure you might laugh, but you don't value laughter or understand joy the way that you would. This is like you don't understand light without dark, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, of course, is it better to have your whole life be completely free of mourning and suffering and grief, and just full of laughter? Well, I don't think you would actually appreciate that laughter or really know what that laughter meant if you didn't have those other things.
Yeah, yeah, that is very true. Yeah, I wasn't even going to bring this up, but so the day we're recording is the 2-year anniversary of Luke's death. So this has been, and when I saw that we were covering chapter 7 this morning, I thought, well, how fitting is that? And as I was reflecting on these verses, I was thinking, I don't. You can experience happiness without having, any kind of great suffering. But I don't think you can really know what joy is unless you've experienced that. Because
Yeah.
that's you learn joy. This sounds very counterintuitive, but you learn joy only in suffering. Because then, you're not happy when you're suffering, but you certainly can be joyful. The sun of joy can be shining even when dark clouds are beneath it. It's there, still there. And you learn joy by learning that, yeah, even in the midst of suffering and loss and death and all of the terrible things that accompany that, well, the source of your joy is still there. God is still there. And you learn to find that joy even in the midst of the suffering because you know that ultimately the suffering is temporary, thanks be to God, but the joy is everlasting. So as hard as it is to go through mourning and everything else that accompanies the loss of someone, it does teach you true joy. because it anchors you in that which is not ephemeral like laughter, but it anchors you in that which is eternal, which is, of course, God, who is the source of joy.
I was asked once about what the difference between happiness and joy is, which I think is actually a pretty tough question, because certainly the Bible speaks about those things differently, but it's not clear like what the difference is. You're like, well, because we kind of use them interchangeably, or they feel the same. But I think, and I don't know if this is the best explanation, but my response was, well, happiness is of course not bad. Happiness is good, but happiness is certainly a feeling, and it is certainly fleeting.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, Whereas joy, you discover, is something deeper and is durable,
Mm.
and that's the difference, is in the durability of the thing, right? Joy is is something that's way down, and it doesn't go away. It's not as, in a lot of ways it's not as flashy. It's not bursting forward with laughter, and it's not that. But it's more steady and more durable, and it's why it's like the thing that you ultimately need, and it's why you'll have texts say like the joy of the Lord is our strength. Well, that's not like some kind of giggly thing. It's like this deep, durable dependency on God that is far more unshakable than just, hey, we're having a good time, aren't we?
Yeah. 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 That is totally true. It has a subjective quality to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a work of the Spirit. What's the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy,
Yeah.
peace, patience, kindness, goodness, these things. So it's a work of the Spirit, and therefore it's a God-given objective reality that is different than just kind of happiness, which it's an emotion. It comes and it goes, and thank God for those times when you do have happiness. I mean, that's great. There's nothing wrong with happiness, but it's not that objective gift from the Spirit that joy is. That's something much more adorable.
I once thought that the difference between happiness and joy is sort of like the difference between liking someone and loving them.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
which is there's nothing wrong with liking people. I like a lot of people, but it's not the same as loving somebody.
Mm, yeah.
Because actually, and you know this, you can, when you love somebody, you don't always like them.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
but
Yeah,
you love them. In other words, and joy doesn't mean that you having joy does not mean that you are necessarily happy.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you can love your own children and not like them sometimes,
Yeah,
right?
you're
It's,
certainly
it's
you can love your spouse and have times where you don't like them very much.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah. The love abides. The love is objective. The love is durable. But the liking, yeah, it ebbs and flows, and
And it's always
same
like,
with joy and happiness.
and of course, it's always great when you can have both. Like when you love someone and you're getting along, and you're like, man, I really like you too, and that's great.
Hmm.
But I know that
Yeah,
that liking will come and go. But love is the thing that's important, that it stays, right? And that's
yeah.
kind of how joy is too. And if you can have joy and happiness, great. That's great. But the happiness will go, and it'll come back, and it'll go, and it'll come back. But the joy
Hmm.
stays.
Yeah, yeah. Amen. All right. Let's see. We got a few more minutes. Let's take 7 and following and see what we can come up with here. He goes on after talking about the laughter of fools being like the crackling of thorns under a pot, and that being vanity. He says in verse 7, surely oppression drives the wise into madness. That Hebrew for oppression could also be translated as extortion. I think maybe there are some translations that put it that way. So oppression or extortion drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? Oh, nostalgia here, right? Why? Don't say, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this, or to phrase it differently, more negatively, it is from foolishness that you ask, why were 4 days better than these? Wisdom is good with an inheritance, or that could also be translated, wisdom is as good as an inheritance. The Hebrew preposition there is capable of being translated either way. So wisdom is good with an inheritance, or wisdom is as good as an inheritance, and an advantage to those who see the sun. For the shade or the protection of wisdom is like the shade or the protection of money. And the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? And let me finish this out with verse 14. It kind of concludes this section. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider God has made one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So this section is a little bit more challenging to at least for me, to discern any kind of good kind of thematic connection between all of these various verses. He is certainly continuing with this idea of something being better than something else that he to which he posed the question at the beginning of the last chapter. So an end of something is better than its beginning, and to be patient is better than to be proud. And then he talks about anger. He says it's better. He doesn't say this explicitly, but implicitly, it's better not to be quick to be angry, because that kind of anger, though, that's what happens in the heart of fools. And then he goes on to talk about wisdom being good, but it's even better if it has an inheritance along with it, because both of these can be kind of a shade or protection for a person. Now, I think all of this is kind of leading into the last couple of verses. So this is better than that, and that's better than this. If you can have both, it's even better. But then he gets in verse 13 to this. He says, now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to consider the work of God. So as you kind of lift your eyes from all of these comparisons we've been making, and you look at God, come on, who can make straight what he has made crooked? So you can't really change the way that God has made things. This, by the way, crooked is not like God is crooked. It's simply using the image of, if God has made something this way, you can't change it to another way. If he's made something crooked, well, there's no way you're going to be able to straighten that. So in the end, well, if you're joyful, if you're prosperous, be joyful. But if you're having adversity, consider this: God made one as well as the other. And as a result of that, we're kind of left the same place we've been all through Ecclesiastes. If we're living life under the sun, well, we are severely limited in our understanding and our ability to figure life out. The best we can do is figure out what is better than something else.
Yeah, this section has the verse I quote most often from Ecclesiastes. It's not the most famous verse. There's lots of famous verses, but it's the one that I certainly have used the most. Yes, this is. I've probably said this many times on the podcast. I've probably quoted this because I see this happen. I see people ignore verse 10 from Solomon constantly, and I want to make sure that as I grow older, that I try not to do this. And you know what this is, Chad? I mean, it's the things were so much better back in the good old days. And you go on Facebook or wherever social media, and you'll find no shortage of this right now. People will talk about like, man, it's worse than it's ever been, or this is like this isn't the way I remember it. And I just want you to know that it is not from wisdom that anyone is saying that. And that might sound harsh, but that is the case. This idea that things were, because when people say that, oh, the days of my youth, or like, oh, things were so much better when I was younger or whatever, what they mean, especially when Christians do it, what they mean is like things were more righteous, things were more moral, things were more correct, right? And the truth is, no, they weren't. And that's why he says it's not from wisdom that you say this. It's just from nostalgia. It's just because you were more comfortable with the predominant sins of your day than you are of the sins of the next generation or whatever it is. But it is a foolish thing to think that somehow you're living in like the most uniquely terrible time that's ever been. It's just not true. And so take Solomon's advice and don't do that.
Yeah, yeah. We all have very edited memories of the of the past.
You sound like a fool when you say it. You sound like you've never read history. It sounds foolish when you say it. And so, but I do understand the temptation to say it because, first of all, you're always selective in your remembering of the past. Like you remember the good things, and so of course it seems very good. So there's that part, and yeah, that makes it sound foolish. Like when you paint the past with the brightest of colors. Somebody who didn't live in that would be like, wait a minute, I read a book. Are you sure it was? That's not what I read. It sounds way worse than that. And you have this sort of thing too at the beginning of this section, which I think is pretty good too, where where he has like, surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. If you do obtain wisdom, that one of the temptations of the wise is to then use that wisdom in ways to gain things for themselves. And so this is the temptation that, and we see this. There's a lot of smart people that figure out how to get much for themselves. But this
Work the system, yeah.
Yeah, but this becomes what? Like this will drive you into madness, right? Where you will use your wisdom for self-gain. And then and this is like a bribe corrupts the heart. You will become corrupt yourself. And so like the danger of being very wise is that maybe you're a little wiser than other people, and then you take advantage of that wisdom and become an oppressor.
Yeah. And I think we're at the stop there.
Yes.
We're at our 40 minutes is up. So we'll pick up with 7:15 next episode.
All right. I'll see you then.
Hi, this is Chad Bird. Have you ever felt lost? I don't mean you've dismissed a term, but I mean deeply lost in the challenges of life. My new book, Hitchhiking with Prophets, invites you to catch a ride back to our real home with Jesus. Join me as we sit shotgun with legendary storytellers of old like Abraham, Moses, David, and Isaiah. As each companion tells their story, you'll find that they're all pointing us to be on the lookout for the promised seed, the Messiah. Order your copy today and join me in discovering that despite life's twists and turns, we are never truly lost, but always being led home to Jesus.